The blue lights hit your rearview mirror so suddenly that for half a second you think it might be another car behind you. Then the siren chirps once. Your stomach tightens. Your hands move toward the steering wheel almost automatically. You glance at your speedometer, even though it's already too late. The officer stays behind you for several long seconds before you finally pull onto the shoulder. Cars keep flying past at 70 miles an hour while you sit there wondering one thing nobody likes to admit out loud. What did I do wrong? And here's the question I want you to think about before we go any further. Have you ever been pulled over by police and later realized the stop became more serious because of something small you said, did, or failed to understand? Tell me your experience in the comments, because a lot of drivers honestly don't realize how quickly a routine stop can change direction once an officer starts observing behavior instead of just the traffic violation itself. And stay with me all the way through this, because one of the biggest myths older drivers still believe about roadside questioning in 2026 is quietly causing people to get themselves into trouble without even noticing it. A lot of people are hearing phrases like instant fines, automated roadside enforcement, and new highway safety protocols, and assuming this is just another exaggerated news cycle. It's not. Highway enforcement across the United States has changed dramatically over the last few years, and 2026 is bringing several shifts that especially affect senior drivers, whether they realize it or not. Now let me be clear about something before people misunderstand this conversation. Not every officer is looking to escalate situations. Most traffic stops begin very simply, but what many drivers fail to understand is that officers are trained to gather information from dozens of tiny observations before they ever decide whether a warning, citation, or deeper investigation is going to happen. And older drivers often get caught off guard because they're relying on habits that worked 20 or 30 years ago. Back then, if you were polite, handed over your license, and explained yourself calmly, there was a good chance you'd drive away with a warning. Today, officers are watching much more than politeness. They're watching hesitation, memory gaps, confusion, delayed reactions, nervous movements, repeated explanations, contradictory answers, medication indicators, vehicle condition, even how long it takes you to find your insurance card. That doesn't mean you're guilty of anything, but it does mean the stop can shift directions before you even realize it's happening. One of the biggest changes coming into 2026 involves expanded digital citation systems tied directly into patrol vehicle databases. In many states, officers now receive immediate registration alerts, insurance verification updates, license status checks, and even prior citation histories while they're still walking toward your car. Years ago, there was more delay, more uncertainty. Sometimes, an officer had to manually verify information. Now, the system often knows things before the conversation even starts. And this is where many senior drivers accidentally make mistakes. Imagine this scenario. You're driving home after dinner. Maybe it's dark. Maybe your hearing isn't what it used to be at night with road noise. You accidentally drift slightly over the lane marker for 2 seconds. That's enough. The officer activates the lights. The officer approaches. Evening. Do you know why I stopped you tonight? Now right there is where people create problems for themselves every single day. Drivers panic because they think silence looks suspicious, so they start talking too much. Oh, officer, I'm sorry. I was probably going a little fast. I was trying to get home before my medication makes me tired. I may have touched the line once or twice. Notice what just happened? The officer didn't accuse you of speeding. The officer didn't mention medication. The officer didn't mention impairment. But now those ideas entered the stop because the driver volunteered them under pressure. And pressure changes people. One thing many drivers do not appreciate is how psychologically uncomfortable traffic stops are designed to feel. The flashing lights, the officer standing above you, the waiting, the pauses, the repeated questions. Sometimes officers intentionally repeat questions in slightly different ways because they're measuring consistency, not just collecting answers. That matters more now because highway enforcement in 2026 is increasingly focused on behavioral indicators instead of just obvious violations. A lot of older drivers think, if I haven't been drinking and I'm not breaking the law, I have nothing to worry about. That sounds logical, but roadside interactions do not always unfold according to logic. They unfold according to perception, and perception can change quickly. Another major change arriving in many highway systems involves expanded use of roadside camera integration and automatic violation processing. Some jurisdictions are implementing systems where certain violations are documented digitally, and citations can be issued almost immediately with far less discretion than before. That word matters, discretion, because discretion used to save drivers all the time. An officer might overlook something minor because you seemed respectful, or because the officer felt the situation didn't justify paperwork. But automated systems reduce human flexibility. If the violation is recorded, documented, and entered instantly, the room for "I'll let you off with a warning" starts shrinking. And senior drivers who are unfamiliar with digital enforcement systems are particularly vulnerable because many still expect conversations to matter more than recorded data. Now here's something else that creates tension during stops that people rarely discuss honestly. Officers are trained to observe cognitive processing speed. That doesn't mean they're diagnosing medical conditions on the roadside, but they absolutely notice delayed responses, confusion during questioning, difficulty locating documents, or inconsistent answers. Imagine an officer asks, "Where are you coming from tonight?" The driver pauses. Well, I stopped at my daughter's. No, wait, first we had dinner." Now maybe that's completely innocent. Maybe the driver is nervous, but nervousness itself becomes part of the officer's assessment. And here's where things become complicated for older drivers. Many seniors naturally process stressful interactions more slowly under pressure. That alone can unintentionally create suspicion during modern roadside evaluations. Then comes another question. Have you had anything to drink tonight? People think this question is simple. It's not. Officers are listening carefully to how answers are delivered. Fast denial, delayed denial, over-explaining, irritation, humor, eye movement, hand movement, voice cracks, repetition. Because officers know something most civilians don't. Innocent people often behave nervously too. That's why stops can become emotionally exhausting, even when somebody has done absolutely nothing criminal. And there's another change happening that older drivers especially need to understand. More departments are increasing roadside wellness and impairment checks involving prescription medications. Now pay attention here because this catches people by surprise constantly. You can be completely sober from alcohol and still face serious roadside problems if an officer believes medication may be affecting driving ability. That doesn't automatically mean arrest, but it can absolutely lengthen the stop. Suppose an officer notices slow speech, shaky hands, confusion, or delayed reactions. Maybe the driver casually mentions blood pressure medication, pain medication, sleep medication, or anxiety medication. The stop changes tone immediately. The officer may suddenly become more formal. "Sir, when was the last time you took that medication?" Now the driver feels trapped because the conversation no longer feels like a simple traffic stop. And many seniors panic at this point because they fear any hesitation will look guilty. So they start talking even more. This is one reason experienced attorneys constantly warn people not to volunteer unnecessary information during traffic stops. Not because officers are evil, not because every stop is unfair, but because stress causes people to create confusion where none existed before, and confusion invites scrutiny. One extremely important 2026 issue involves instant electronic proof systems for insurance and registration. More officers now expect drivers to retrieve digital proof quickly on smartphones. Sounds simple, right? Not always. Older drivers often become flustered unlocking phones under pressure. Apps freeze, bright flashlight beams hit the windshield, notifications pop up, hands shake. Then the officer watches the driver fumbling through screens for 2 minutes. Again, that doesn't prove wrongdoing, but long delays can affect the atmosphere of the stop. And here's another reality many people don't understand. Officers often become more suspicious when a stop takes longer than expected, because prolonged interaction creates more opportunities to notice behavior. That's why simple preparation matters more than people think. Now let's talk about one of the biggest misunderstandings involving roadside questioning. A lot of drivers believe if they remain silent or decline to answer questions, officers will immediately become hostile. Sometimes they might become less conversational, yes, but many experienced officers actually expect drivers to be cautious. The mistake is how people try to invoke their rights emotionally instead of calmly. There's a huge difference between, "I know my rights, you can't ask me that," and, "Officer, I'd prefer not to answer questions beyond what's legally required." Tone changes everything. Body language changes everything. Officers are human beings operating in uncertain situations near moving traffic at night. They assess threat levels constantly. Sudden aggression, sarcasm, or performative internet lawyer behavior almost always escalates tension unnecessarily. And seniors sometimes unintentionally create tension simply because frustration shows differently with age. A tired voice, irritated sigh, repeated questioning, or confusion can accidentally come across as resistance, even when no disrespect is intended. Another important change many drivers are going to notice in 2026 is increased passenger interaction during stops. Years ago, passengers often remained largely ignored unless something unusual happened. Today, officers increasingly observe and question passengers separately when circumstances appear inconsistent. Imagine this. The officer asks the driver where they're headed. "Going home from dinner." Then the officer casually asks the passenger, "Where do you folks eat tonight?" The passenger hesitates. "Oh, we were visiting family." Now there's inconsistency. Completely innocent inconsistency, maybe, but inconsistency nonetheless. And suddenly the officer's attention sharpens. This is why traffic stops become psychologically difficult. Tiny details start carrying weight they normally wouldn't. Another issue seniors need to know about involves vehicle exit requests. A lot of drivers still believe officers need extraordinary reasons to ask someone out of the vehicle during a lawful stop. In reality, courts have generally allowed officers broad authority to order drivers and passengers out during traffic stops for safety reasons. But the emotional impact of this moment is huge. An officer says, "Sir, step out of the vehicle for me." The driver's heart rate spikes instantly because now it feels serious. And here's where people make dangerous mistakes. Some refuse immediately because they think compliance equals guilt. Others move too suddenly because panic takes over. Some start reaching into pockets without explanation. Some continue arguing while exiting. Officers are watching every movement during these moments because roadside exits are unpredictable and potentially dangerous situations for law enforcement too. What many civilians interpret as aggression is sometimes simply heightened officer caution. That doesn't mean every officer behaves appropriately. Some absolutely overreach. Some become confrontational unnecessarily. But understanding the psychology on both sides matters if you want to avoid making a stressful situation worse. Now let me mention something that almost nobody talks about openly enough. Silence creates pressure, and officers know that. Long pauses during questioning are uncomfortable by design. Humans naturally want to fill silence. Drivers begin explaining things nobody asked about. "I'm just nervous because my friend got arrested once. I know I looked tired, but I worked late. I wasn't texting, I was checking directions." Notice the pattern? People often introduce possible problems while trying to sound innocent. This becomes especially important under newer highway enforcement policies emphasizing distracted driving crackdowns. In many states, officers are aggressively monitoring phone usage now because distracted driving statistics remain high. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Many drivers lie badly about phone use. The officer already saw the downward glance, the glowing screen, the delayed lane correction. Then the driver says, "I never touched my phone." That kind of obvious denial damages credibility instantly. A smarter approach is staying calm and avoiding unnecessary elaboration. Another major issue affecting seniors in 2026 involves updated vision and reaction-related driving concerns. Some states are quietly tightening scrutiny around elderly driver safety following increased accident data involving older motorists. Now, this topic makes people defensive very quickly because nobody likes feeling targeted due to age, understandably so. But officers are absolutely trained to observe indicators connected to driver capability regardless of age. Difficulty hearing commands, delayed braking, confusion about location, failure to notice emergency lights quickly, drifting patterns, improper turns, overcorrection. And once an officer begins suspecting cognitive or physical impairment, the stop can become much longer and more uncomfortable. Imagine being asked the same question twice. "Sir, do you know where you are right now?" The driver becomes offended. "I'm not stupid." But the officer may simply be evaluating orientation and awareness. That emotional misunderstanding changes the entire interaction. This is why emotional control during stops matters far more than most people realize. Not fake politeness, not submissiveness, just controlled communication. And let's talk honestly about another thing officers notice immediately: reaching movements. Nothing spikes tension faster during a nighttime stop than sudden movement inside the vehicle. Yet people still do it constantly. The lights appear and immediately drivers start digging through glove compartments, center consoles, purses, bags, and under seats before the officer even reaches the window. From the driver's perspective, they're preparing documents helpfully. From the officer's perspective, visibility disappears and uncertainty rises. That's why many officers approach already alert and tense before a single word gets spoken. Then the driver sees the officer acting cautious and thinks, "Why is this officer so aggressive?" Meanwhile, the officer is thinking, "Why was this person reaching around so much?" Two completely different interpretations of the same moment. One thing I think older drivers especially underestimate is how much modern policing relies on cumulative observations instead of dramatic evidence. Rarely does a stop become serious because of one thing alone. It's usually several tiny observations stacked together: slight drifting, slow response, shaking hands, medication mention, inconsistent timeline, delayed document retrieval, visible confusion. None alone prove wrongdoing, but together they may justify extended investigation from the officer's perspective. And yes, this frustrates people deeply because innocent behavior can resemble suspicious behavior under stress. That's reality. Now here's another 2026 change many people are going to hate: increased enforcement partnerships between highway patrol units and insurance data systems. In some jurisdictions, lapses in coverage are identified almost instantly during stops. Drivers who assume the system probably hasn't updated yet are discovering very quickly that databases are far more synchronized than they used to be, and the financial consequences can hit immediately. Some drivers are shocked to learn that what once might have resulted in a warning now triggers mandatory citations, towing risks, or administrative penalties. This especially impacts older drivers who may drive infrequently and accidentally overlook renewal notices, digital billing alerts, or policy updates. And officers hear the same explanation constantly: "I thought it renewed automatically." Sometimes that explanation is true, but roadside discretion has narrowed in many areas because electronic verification systems leave less ambiguity. Now let's discuss something psychologically fascinating that happens during many stops. Officers often mirror energy. If the driver becomes highly emotional, defensive, sarcastic, or erratic, the officer's demeanor frequently hardens in response. If the driver remains calm and measured, many officers unconsciously lower tension too. Not always, but often. This is why experienced drivers understand that the emotional tone of the first 30 seconds matters enormously. A shaky, angry voice saying, "Why are you stopping me?" feels very different from, "Good evening, officer." Again, this is not about surrendering rights. It's about understanding human interaction under pressure. And there's one mistake that has exploded recently because of social media influence. People trying to win the traffic stop. That mindset is dangerous. Drivers now arrive mentally prepared for confrontation because they've watched endless videos online showing roadside arguments. But edited clips rarely show the full timeline leading to escalation. Real roadside interactions are unpredictable. Adrenaline affects memory. Fear affects tone. Officers don't know who they're approaching. Drivers don't know how the officer will behave. Treating the encounter like a courtroom debate on the shoulder of a highway at night is usually a terrible strategy, especially for seniors who may already be dealing with stress, hearing limitations, medication effects, or slower reaction times. Another thing many older drivers need to understand about 2026 highway enforcement is the increased use of observational DUI investigations, even without obvious intoxication. People think DUI investigations only happen when somebody reeks of alcohol. Not true. Officers now receive extensive training on divided attention behaviors. For example, can the driver answer questions while retrieving documents? Do they forget instructions midway through? Do they repeat themselves? Do they struggle maintaining conversation flow? Again, these observations are not automatic proof of impairment, but they influence officer judgment heavily. Now imagine a senior driver under stress, trying to multitask during flashing lights at midnight while traffic roars past. Of course, mistakes happen, and unfortunately, nervous mistakes can look suspicious. That's why preparation before you ever get stopped matters more than most people think. Know where your documents are. Keep movements slow and visible. Avoid volunteering unnecessary explanations. Listen carefully before responding. Do not argue roadside legal theories. Do not physically resist instructions, even if you believe the stop is unfair. And one more thing people need to hear clearly. Many drivers unintentionally escalate stops because they confuse emotional honesty with strategic communication. They think, if I explain enough, the officer will understand. Sometimes the opposite happens. Over-explaining creates contradictions. Contradictions create suspicion. Suspicion creates longer stops. Longer stops create more stress. More stress creates more mistakes. It becomes a loop. Now let me tell you about a scenario that perfectly illustrates how fast ordinary interactions can spiral. A driver gets stopped for rolling slightly through a stop sign. Simple enough. The officer approaches politely. "License and registration, please." The driver immediately begins apologizing nervously. "Oh, I'm sorry, officer. I'm exhausted. I haven't slept much. My medication's been affecting me all week." Right there, the stop changes categories mentally. Now the officer is no longer just evaluating a stop sign violation. The officer is evaluating possible driver impairment. The driver notices the officer's tone changing. "What medication are you taking?" Now panic rises. The driver starts backtracking. No, I mean it's nothing serious." Too late. The issue has already entered the investigation. And this is why people need to understand how traffic stop conversations actually function in real life, instead of how they imagine them functioning. Officers are not merely collecting facts. They are continuously assessing risk, impairment, deception, emotional stability, and unpredictability. Every answer contributes to that assessment. And yes, sometimes officers make wrong judgments. Sometimes innocent people get scrutinized unfairly. Sometimes personalities clash. Sometimes communication fails badly. But understanding the dynamics helps drivers avoid unintentionally worsening situations, especially seniors. Because older drivers often grew up in an era where interactions with police were more conversational and less data-driven. Today's roadside stops are different. Patrol cars are mobile information centers now. Officers frequently know your registration status, insurance status, vehicle history, and sometimes prior citations before your window even comes down. That changes the psychology of the encounter. The officer already has information. The questions are often less about discovering facts and more about comparing your responses against existing data and behavioral observations. And that surprises people. One final thing that deserves attention involves post-stop behavior. A lot of drivers think the interaction ends once the citation is issued. Not necessarily. Officers often continue observing behavior as vehicles re-enter traffic. I've seen situations where drivers leave angrily, accelerate aggressively, fail to signal, or drive erratically immediately afterward because emotions are high. That can trigger additional enforcement instantly. Remember, adrenaline doesn't disappear just because the officer walks away. And for seniors especially, emotional recovery after a tense stop may take longer than expected. Hands shake, focus drops, decision-making slows temporarily. That's real. Which is why sometimes the smartest thing you can do after a stressful stop is sit for a moment before pulling back onto the highway. Because these interactions linger psychologically longer than people admit. The flashing lights fade in the mirror eventually, the officer drives away, traffic keeps moving. But most drivers replay every word afterward. Should I have answered differently? Why did the officer ask that twice? Did I say too much? Did I seem nervous? That uncertainty stays with people because traffic stops are one of the few moments where ordinary citizens suddenly find themselves under direct scrutiny, pressure, and observation all at once. And in 2026, with faster digital enforcement, tighter highway monitoring, increased behavioral analysis, and reduced officer discretion in many situations, those moments are becoming even more complicated than most drivers realize before the lights ever come on behind them.